Now we have to move on to the second part of our event, and now we would like to get the understanding on how does climate change look like? What is the face of climate change? Because I hope, at least in the first part, you more or less got some background regarding how we can know that there's climate change, but then how does it look like? So this is going to be about that. And as a first speaker, it is my honor to invite Professor Hans Otto Portner. Please, Professor, join us. He is the head of the Department of Integrative Ecopsychology at the Alfred Wegener Institute for Marine and Polar Research in Germany. But I guess for us the most important fact is that you are one of the key persons in the whole IPCC, and currently you are the co-chair of the working group that is particularly looking at climate change impacts, adaptation and vulnerability. So you would be the right person whom we should ask whether there is a problem and should be worried about. So, Professor, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you very much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure for me to be here. It was interesting to discover that it's very nice and warm in your country as well. The summer is early, and we have had even higher temperatures in northern Germany, which is quite unusual for us as well. As you've heard, I'm representing IPCC Working Group 2, the working group that is focusing on impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. In my parallel life, I'm doing research in polar areas. I'm working for the German Polar Research Organization, the Alfred Wegener Institute in Bremerhaven in Germany, and I'm an animal physiologist. We are looking at how organisms, how animals, fish and invertebrates adapt to the climate regime that they live in and what it means for them if that climate regime is changing. Now, if you work for the IPCC, you certainly take a broader view. You consider not only your own special interest, you have integrated into the larger picture of how climate change is impacting the world. And this is something I would like to give you an impression of. And all parts of the world, all oceans, all continents are affected by climate change, and that is a very clear result of the last assessment report. So there are widespread observed impacts, and we live in a changing world, but there are some parts of the world that are especially affected, and one part is the frozen world, as we would call it. Scientists would call it the cryosphere. And the poles, the Arctic, the Antarctic, and mountain glaciers are especially affected. They are melting. And while we may say, okay, these places are usually far from us, we are affected by it, and because we see sea level is rising, all that water makes it into the ocean, causes sea level to rise, and the projections, the long-term projections for how high sea level will actually be rising are a crucial matter to investigate, because they may actually be rising to levels where coastal cities are affected, and they are in some places actually they are already affected by rising sea level. Another prominent example from the last assessment report is that the tropics and the tropical oceans are especially affected. Here you see a picture of a warm water coral reef, places where you may want to travel to spend a vacation. Well, I can tell you that we are working hard to get rid of these places under climate change, because they are already starting to fade away. They are losing their cover with live corals because of the rising temperature extremes in those places, and the projection for them do not look good at the moment. Even if we keep to the current climate targets as agreed in Paris, we are facing some likelihood that we may lose up to 90% of those ecosystems due to global warming. So there is a global picture there that we need to integrate if we talk about our national interests, about our national policies. We are not alone. We are all part of the same planet, and we only have one planet, and we should look after after it and not play with it. Another item I listed on this slide is the small islands, the small island states. Some of them are independent countries. Yes, they have a small population, and some of them exist on atolls. They live on the top of coral reefs, essentially, and they are affected by both the rising sea level and the demise of the corals that cannot live in hot ocean or in warmer ocean waters. And the sensitivity thresholds are quite clear, around 29 degrees Celsius. If temperatures go beyond that, these animals have problems, physiological problems, and this leads to widespread coral bleaching and then death of these corals. So there are changes occurring, and we need to watch out, and we can do something about it. We can make decisions. Our policymakers could make decisions if they have this long-term perspective in mind and want to keep our planet in as healthy state as possible. So during the last report, we have been, and the map underneath here is not very well depicted on the screen. We have been compiling examples where we know that climate change has caused this impact. And scientists go through a very careful process of detecting an impact, first of all, and attributing it to a parameter that is linked to climate. And that is not always temperature. It could also be elevated CO2. It could also be oxygen in the ocean. It could also be the level and intensity of precipitation, which is on the rise in extreme events. Or it could also be the deficiency of water in places where water has been plentiful before. And you see here that there is impacts. There are impacts depicted by symbols, and you also see that for each of these examples there has been a careful assessment of the confidence of knowledge that we have with respect to whether these impacts are occurring and whether they can be tied to climate change. And here you see for North America there are some examples. You have heard about wildfires in California. You have, there are also impacts of sea level rise already. There's a degrading coastline on the east coast and also in the Arctic. And then you see there are changes in ecosystems on land and in the oceans. The fish and the trees depict that. And there are also changes in ecosystems along shorelines due to climate change, and water distribution on the continent is being affected. Similarly, if we go to South and Central America, we have impacts on people, on coasts. We have impacts again on water in different places. The hydrology is changing, water availability is changing, and here you also see there's an impact on agriculture. And that is certainly something of concern, and that is being looked at currently in the special report on climate change and land in more detail. And also the Antarctic is affected, changing terrestrial ecosystems and marine ecosystems. And you see in all of these places where there are glaciers, where there are ice sheets on continents, we see them being affected by the warming, meaning essentially that glaciers are losing their masses and the ice sheets are also losing their masses, and scientists are currently struggling to find out how much this will be contributing to sea level rise. Now we have Europe here depicted, and you see again people are being affected, in many places, ecosystems on land and in the oceans. And in Europe we also have some impact on agriculture. Actually, some places may benefit due to the warming, especially if they live, for people in the higher latitudes. Certainly there is an opening of areas for agriculture that weren't available for that so far. Then there's Africa, where we have scattered data, and that is a problem in places where sciences, the natural sciences and the social sciences are not well developed and the literature is not there to really provide profound information. We have a problem in depicting and monitoring all these impacts because we depend on the information that is in the scientific literature. And then there's Australia, which is quite severely affected. The Great Barrier Reef is a prominent example. You've probably heard of it in the media, how has been affected by the recent bleaching events during the El Nino, the degree of warming going beyond the tolerance thresholds for that systems. And again, you have water problems, changes in terrestrial ecosystems, and impacts on agriculture. So quite a diverse list of examples across the globe. But once you go into regions, so we have a very firm picture for the globe itself, but once to go into specific regions, detecting and attributing individual impacts to climate change is always more challenging than if we look at the global picture. Further examples, crops. The growing of crops is actually something that is of concern. For a growing world population, we see that the productivity of crops is projected to decline in a warming world, concerning wheat, rice, and maize especially, indicating already we should keep to a climate target. We should keep climate change within limits. Same is happening in the oceans. There is a redistribution of organisms in the oceans, including fish. So fish stocks are moving with the degree of warming, and they're currently moving already to different degrees, like most of them sort of 20 to 40 kilometers per decade, moving towards the poles, getting out of the waters where they currently are because it's getting too warm for them, looking for new places. And since this is a species-specific effect, there will be a mixing of ecosystems, but also there will be a disappearance of fish stocks from places where they formerly were, causing a political problem between countries who have an interest to keep and call these fish stocks part of their own national heritage. So there are risks of climate change. And the risks of climate change increase with continued high emissions. That is a general statement that we can make. And also, when we look at the extreme events, the increasing magnitudes of warming, of global warming, increase the likelihood of severe and pervasive impacts. And I've already mentioned the wildfires and the wildfire seasons, which have been very prominently in the press in California. Part of that is certainly climate change. And who is affected? And we must say everybody is affected, but there is a relationship with the degree of development of a country and with the level of poverty of people. To what extent they are closely tied to the natural resources that they have available to them. And the vulnerability and exposure rises with the level of poverty. Not everybody has air conditioning available and a car to drive distances to get into cooler places. So developed countries, however, are also affected. And this prominent picture shows a flooding due to sea level rise, due to extreme events is on a rise, and intensity of precipitation events is on a rise with climate change, and there have already been examples clearly that can be attributed to such patterns. So we need to do something about reducing and managing risks. We can do that, and how would we do that? We do that by adaptation. For example, if you think of sea level rise in places where we make sense, where this makes sense, we build higher dikes. And this is certainly already occurring. But we also need to quantify the level of risk. We need to set risk thresholds depending on the degree of climate change. And scientists have developed models that tell us about how the temperature will be developing into the future depending on what we do. And we are here, and this is the time for us to decide which trajectory do we want to take. Do we want to let climate change go on unabated and temperature rise by the end of century in a global mean by something like 4 to 5 degrees? Or do we want to go into ambitious mitigation, reducing CO2 emissions and thereby reducing the degree of climate change, keeping risk thresholds in mind that have been quantified and qualified for different sectors. And the Arctic and the coral reefs are here in the first column, unique and threatened systems. And you see here the risk transitions from undetectable to moderate to high to very high according to color code. And you see there is a transition from yellow to red already happening, even if we keep to the climate target of 1.5 degrees according to the Paris Agreement. So risk thresholds help us define when climate change becomes dangerous. And for some systems, it's already becoming dangerous. That is something we need to keep in mind, but we need to do something. So there's a sense of urgency coming from this message. Our policymakers need to have the long-term climate developments in mind when they make their short-term decisions. And this is probably a dilemma in human psychology that should also be part of scientific research. Adaptation is already occurring. Small islands are planting mangroves that they may have cut before because they needed the wood. But now they are restoring it because they know if they have a large mangrove belt around their islands, this will help them against storms, surges, and rising sea level. It will buy them time, definitely. And as I said, we could build higher dikes, and certainly the Netherlands are a prominent example for how you can do that and how we can adapt and keep the water out. But there are limits to this adaptation effort. So adaptation is already occurring, but without mitigation, adaptation will be insufficient in many cases. And those adaptation limits we need to keep in mind. Bringing our efforts to reduce emissions and the efforts to adapt to climate change, which we need to be doing because climate change is happening and is having impacts, combining these two approaches would be a precondition to build a more vibrant world, and I would like to encourage us to think along those ways for building a better future. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor. Please don't go away. So, do we have some questions from the floor? Yes, here we have one. Do we have some others? And they're at the back, on the left side as well. So we will take both of them, and then Professor will answer. So first you, and then a man at the back. That was, I saw.
Thank you for your presentation. As you said that you are basically based on this scientific information, do you know or do you guess how much are these empty gaps for information or regions, areas that are not, from those are not these scientific information followed?
Well,
okay, go ahead, and then we will have...
Certainly, it's a problem to quantify those gaps. We have those regions in mind. What I can tell you is we are making progress during the 6th assessment cycle to improve on the resolution, especially with respect to the climate information that we have available for regions and also the climate projections into the future. The models are becoming better and better in terms of spatial resolution. This will also then help us to put any observed impacts, because all impact is regional or local, into context of a changing climate parameter. climate driver, and then we become much better in our attribution exercise, attributing an impact to climate change and whether it's anthropogenic climate change or not. So there is a development in the scientific literature that will be captured in the ongoing assessment cycle.
Okay, thanks. And let's have the other question.
Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. My question is, first of all, many of you mentioned that this, what we have now, is maybe possible because of climate change. But at the same time, as you mentioned, very many examples here, people are feeling what is going on, but in our country, in Latvia, not so much, because today it is very warm. Last summer was very cold summer, so people don't feel this so much here. And so, but in democracy, you have to have people's support to do some actions to move forward. But my question is about, in the first presentation, there was a very interesting graph about why we have this climate change, and very much because of burning fossil fuel, burning gas, burning coal. So how do you think, is it possible to make some changes without some very radical solutions, what we're doing with fossil fuels here? Because sometimes we are discussing how we can genetically modify animals to reduce methane emission, how to put animals in the box to capture all the methane, but at the same time we still have to burn fossil fuels, which is negative impact for climate change, negative impact for democracies, a lot of negative impacts, but at the same time it is not moving forward very much. We are still increasing consumption of fossil fuels.
Yeah, thank you very much. You have mentioned certainly one of the core dilemmas of current society in terms of that we would like to keep our mode of life and use the instruments and the tools and the ways that we are used to. But there are certainly scientific solutions, science-based solutions around which indicate that there are opportunities for change. If you think about the burning of fossil fuel, my own country is currently in a sleeping mode when it comes to the further enhancement of the use of renewable energy, but it has made one contribution during the last 10-20 years. It has made solar energy and wind energy competitive. And the prices for solar and wind power are currently less than the price for using coal for producing electric energy. So these kind of developments, new technological developments, bring them to the market, make them competitive, and them being competitive in comparison to established technologies, I think is an important element and should give us hope that there is a future. Let's take another example, electric vehicles. There is currently a strong move to push for for the production of electric vehicles, and interesting, the push is strongest from countries like China because they have a pollution problem in their cities. They have bought too many German cars, and now they have a diesel problem, and they have pollution in the cities. They have smog. Certainly industry is contributing largely to that as well. But now they have made a decision. If you want to buy a new car, it has to be either electric or you have to ask for a permit to use one that is still burning fossil fuels. This said, there's still many other technological options. It's not just electric vehicles. We could use synthetic fuels like wind gas. We could use hydrogen as a fuel for vehicles. So thinking about how to do the same things similar is certainly a good start for the transformation that we would need. And in order to keep to the Paris Agreement, the calculations show us that we need to be down to net zero emissions by 2050. That gives us some time to do something, so it's not so rushed as you might feel, but it also should be a signal to get moving.
Thank you very much. I unfortunately have to close the possibility for asking additional questions. We will see you in a few moments back in the panel, but now I would like to invite Andris Vīksna, who is the head of the forecasting department within Latvian Environmental Geology and Meteorology Center, and he will tell us a bit more precise information on particularly Latvia's case. And I know that he has quite some experience in these issues. So, Andris, you have the floor.
Yeah, paldies.
Thank you. For a change, you will have a presentation in Latvian, and I will tell you about what's happening in Latvia in the context of climate change in the world. As was mentioned before, as we saw and heard, when you see such figures, you have to understand that climate change is ongoing, especially during the last century and during the last decades. The climate change has been felt most acutely, and this is not limited to changes in air temperature or amount of precipitation. There's impact upon sea level, amount of ice, and many other phenomena, including extreme conditions. But still, it's still quite difficult for us to forecast what are we going to have in connection with climate change. As was mentioned before, and as you can see here clearly, here you see anthropogenic influence. And we all have to understand that the grey part is our actions, or perhaps also failure to act. And this is the impact individual and collective, and we can change by becoming more educated and understanding our own impact upon climate. So we, as an organization within this rather complex system, the way we are involved, of course we have rather close connection also with IPCC, more through World Meteorological Organization, because we are one of the many member states in the World Meteorological Organization. And we provide data, climatic data, operational data to these international organizations, and these organizations are analyzing and providing global and regional assessments and analysis. As organization, we are the only one who are dealing with such collection of such data and also monitoring environmental quality. And of course, we also have another part in our work, and that's the most visible one. We are preparing forecasts and warnings. So this is also linked to climate and adaptation. Perhaps that's more on a tactical, operational level, how to get ready, for example. We are going to have storm in 3 days' time, what to do, how to inform people. And lately, another climate change issue is gaining relevance. And of course, here we cannot work alone. We cooperate with other organizations. We are providing information, we are giving data, and we are also receiving data. Basically, in preparing those scripts on scenarios of climate change, we are using IPCC FIPS report. And so we are modeling different climate change with respect to Latvia on the basis of the actual changes that we already know. And so we are working with higher resolution on Latvia. And then we also have a greenhouse gas emission stock taking. We are making calculations, emission calculations. We are using different databases. And so we are providing information to politicians, to organizations, and also to the public. We allow them to make conclusions. So we are using all this to conduct analysis in the field of climate change. Now, what's going on in Latvia? What's happening? Similarly to other places in the world, and especially Europe, as regards air temperature, increase is quite obvious and stable. This is very pronounced in the winter season when this happens most rapidly during the last 50 years. But all in all, this is happening throughout the year. The temperature is on the rise. And here I could also mention another matter which people or society are not really understanding. This correlation between climate and changes in weather conditions. Someone already mentioned the two last summers, which were quite cool, and also in winter we also had snow, deep snow. So we have to understand that the weather conditions, this is what we see on the daily basis. It's in cross-section of a month, of a week, but the climate and also this complies with the definition of World Meteorological Organization. Climate covers a period of at least 30 years. So if we speak about climate, we have to take a longer period. And of course, every day we see that the temperature is changing and precipitation is changing. But also in terms of climate, we see changes, annual changes. And in the recent years, we have had rather cold summers, and then we have had winters very rich in snow. But we have to understand that those extreme cases still remain. And if we look at a longer period, then we are able to identify the trends in climate change, and this is already a long-term trend. Of course, we can talk about average change, but there's another thing which is more dangerous and which I would like to underscore. We see that different extremes and indexes keep changing. For example, here you see the number of summer days when the temperature is reaching at least 25 degrees. And here we see really even faster change. Every year we see such days as this, and of course this leaves an impact upon human health and also energy sector and other sectors. And now about precipitation.
Similarly, not in Europe, but as we saw, the Mediterranean really experiences less precipitation and dry periods, but in Latvia we have quite opposite situation as precipitation amounts increase, and that happens on the expense of winter. Winters become wetter and warmer, but the trend is monitored throughout the year, and precipitation increases. Similarly, as air temperature, we must understand that averages and those extremes, as we can see, a number of days with heavy precipitation increases. In terms of precipitation, that is a challenging parameter, a variability. Especially in our summer season, we observe separate, specific, heavy and very large lightning and storms causing local rain showers. And quantity or amount of precipitation increases as well, and we may face those periods of dryness without any rain in the future as well. When speaking on the future, we can see we have used the research carried out 18 months ago on the IPCC scenario number 5 and RCP 4 and 5 or 8 and 5 with for us to live not worse as yesterday and tomorrow, we must aim at least at RCP 4 and 5. And we are focusing or emphasizing RCP 8.5 more until the end of this century. On the left graph, we can see temperature change in Latvia, where the end of this century is compared to the end of the previous century, at least 5 degrees, and the most change have been observed during winter season. We have several examples of indexes. Average values of the indices, or changes in tropical nights, tropic nights, when the night temperature does not go below 20 degrees. We have a statistically rare number of such nights, but for instance in Riga, but in the future that number will increase and will have effect on the public health, on human health and other sectors of our daily life. Another parameter where we can try to adapt that is the duration of vegetation period or period or season that has been approximately 80 days in the previous centuries that will prolongate or be extended to for 1.5 months. But that will have different challenges. Other insects, other other crops, other plants, and other factors influencing. In terms of precipitation, similar trend is observed on the right graph. The worst scenario, or the worst projection, precipitation change in Latvia with extended increase for between 20 to 40% in winter. Some uncertainty is present in other projections as well, when very active storms and convective storms are observed in Latvia, leading to much local precipitation, which we can observe in recent years as well. Another parameter we have analyzed is average wind speed. That trend is almost negative, but I would like to emphasize that it exceeds average wind speed as wind is monitored on daily basis, and no significant change is observed there. But we have quantified a slight change in the wind speed in the long run, but wind as such associated with the lightning and storms in summer are less subject to forecasting and projecting. In the context of a century, we have no knowledge how favorable those processes would develop in the future. That has different effects both on air temperature, on precipitation and on winds. As Latvia is quite plain country, we have no mountains or any other high hills. Occasionally we face also ice accumulations on rivers in winter, and we had energy crisis some years ago. Then power cables were covered by ice in some years ago, or in Latgale and Vidzeme, where vast territories were flooded due to heavy rainfalls in summer. Therefore, we must count on the changing extremes in the future that can not be projected and forecasted so well. All the information I have mentioned is available at the climate change tool we have developed, alongside with the report where you can read the full report for policymakers, our short version on the data on climate change, how the climate has changed, what climate was before, and what changes have occurred already. In general, somebody would think what those 3 to 5 degrees would actually mean, but actually they have significant influence on and effect on agriculture and all the sectors of our national economy. Although being aware, having awareness and understanding the forthcoming and upcoming risks, we would require a due and efficient adaptation. In the framework of the climate change tool project, we have developed also a database of climate change adaptation monitoring system with different vulnerability risks being identified to identify whether our climate is affected, and adaptation monitoring would be provided based on the adaptation indexes developed and set forth by the experts of all the sectors of national economy. As I've mentioned before, public awareness is very crucial. Understanding in the public on climate change and the consequences it has created. Energy sector, where the data are already uploaded and used for resource analysis and due energy performance planning, and that I hope that it is the first step of our contribution and work, and that monitoring system will be developed more and more vulnerability risk indicators will be included and integrated for monitoring our national economy more. Another slide. That is an example from the system. Vulnerability indicator consists of two parts of meteorological parameters. That is quite a simple example. Vulnerability in terms of winter tourism. There is a number of very cold days without any warming fall, and therefore a number of people keen on winter sports activities decreases, leading to a decreased flow of incoming tourists in a winter period, and people are going outdoors for some sport. Therefore, we observe and quantify high vulnerability, and such analysis has been carried out for all the sectors of national economy in more complicated segmentation, but we can conclude on better opportunities and options for better adaptation. Thank you very much.
Do we have any questions from the floor to Andris? If not, I will not pause any longer because we have to save some time for the discussion in the panel. So, Andris, can you maybe be the first to take a seat in the panel? And I would like to now invite back also Professor Ortner. And I also would like to introduce you to two other speakers for the discussion part specifically. First of all, Dina Popluga from university located just here in Jelgava. She is the Vice Dean at the Faculty of Economics and Social Development at Latvia. She is doing a lot regarding bioeconomy and has special focus on GHG emissions. So I think you are one of the most informed persons, I guess, regarding both aspects, adaptation and mitigation. So please come join us. And also I would like to invite Uģis Rotbergs. Please come. Those of you who are not so well known with Latvia, I can tell you that Uģis Rotbergs is one of most famous faces in environmental protection. He is the chair of WWF Latvia, but he's also a very good specialist in forestry. He has even a Royal Dutch Order of the Golden Ark for his efforts in promoting sustainable forestry. So we are very glad that you were able to join us. So now that we all have you, I think we have around 15 minutes for a discussion, a quick one. So please stay focused. and on top of the climate change issue. And to start, I just wanted to ask to each of you, when did you realize or started believing in climate change, and why? When you started believing in climate change, and why? What made you convinced about climate change? So who would like to be the first? I'm not expecting that you will tell ministry convinced you, of course, so you can be honest.
All ministry, sorry. It started professionally in the early 90s. I read the military defense report to US Congress, which already back then said that that issue of the global warming and climate change is a national security issue. And it was, back then even was Baltic region, so to say, outline with potential scenarios. So it is pretty long time ago. It's still not on the domestic agenda at a level I would like to.
Okay, maybe I can continue. About my personal experience, actually I can say that the first thinking that something has changed since my childhood, and if I compare with these days, is the time when I get my family, my children, and actually it is about 10 years ago when I was just like comparing the winters which I used to have in my childhood and what is now. So I can see that there is changes happening, and actually I can say yes, 10 years from my personal experience, I'm starting to think more and more why it's happening and trying to compare different times, and I can see that it has changed actually quite a lot.
Yeah, thank you for this challenging question. That's really difficult to nail down. But I think for me it started also in the 90s when I moved and joined the Alfred Wegener Institute, looking at polar areas, looking at organisms from these places and how they would be specialized on these different climate regimes. This added temperature to the research that we were doing. And out of this came an understanding of what was changing, and you were looking in the literature, what would happen. And then certainly I got even closer when I started to work with the IPCC during the fourth assessment cycle on a special report on carbon capture and storage, because at the time people were believing that we could dispose of all the CO2 into the ocean rather than into the atmosphere, but that was a bad idea, and we were able to tell the world that this was a bad idea.
Well, for me it was during the 90s as well, and mainly because of the winter time, because I realized, like all the people in Latvia, I suppose, that snow is disappearing somewhere. Well, it is snowing, but these periods with the stable snow cover are not so often anymore, and it is already +2, +3 degrees lately during the summertime. But then technically I realized it when I began my career in the Latvian Met Service. It was 15 years ago when I was, well, at the beginning maybe forced to analyze climate in our databases. So the trend was very clear, it was positive, and then I just understand that it's much more complex system. We cannot talk about only snow cover anymore. It's influence all the parameters and all different sectors. So yeah.
Okay, so it seems that you all have started believing in climate change pretty early. I don't know, what about you, audience? Do you believe in climate change? First I have to ask. Those of you who believe, please raise your hands. Okay. Yes. Of course, thank you, IPCC. You always remind us of this. Okay, I think there were a few persons who didn't raise their hands, and I fully respect that and understand that, because as it was also mentioned in the presentations, it's not so easy actually to see those climate change. You can see weather, but you cannot directly see climate change. Only if you backtrack and put together data that you have in your head or in your mobile or on your computer, then you can see that there is a pattern of changes that is happening all around. Professor, in your presentation, you mentioned the term that those degrees, 2 degrees, 1.5 degrees, is about a moment when climate change becomes dangerous for certain systems. When climate change could become dangerous for us, for example, in the Baltic country. We are in the north. Well, we are not very high in the mountains, but I think in Latvia we feel pretty safe, and many are happy that there will be no snow to clean in the winter time. So when would you say climate change becomes dangerous for us, and others afterwards please feel free to get in.
That is another challenging question, and you know, Northern Europe and the northern part of the northern hemisphere in terms of temperature extremes is quite safe. In some places people may even say, like you emphasize, that climate change is a benefit, less snow and more possibilities for agriculture and so economy and so forth. But this is compensated for by some negative developments further south. So that is why I emphasized we should see ourselves in a wider context. Now, with respect to sea level rise, I know that your country is also seems to be on a safe side, at least for some time, because the crust is rising in this area. And the question I would have here, to what extent is it rising and when does it stop and so forth, whether there are projections about that, because I'm not informed about these details. But sea level rise is something that we certainly need to look out for along European coasts as well, and Latvia is on a coast. So don't ignore that risk, because the long-term perspectives go into the order of magnitude of several meters, and long-term perspective certainly means over centuries. There's a large uncertainty associated with the time frame and the degree of change, but it's all pointing in that direction. So nobody on the planet should say we are on the safe side. I see your country also doesn't have a lot of land to give back to the ocean, so in that respect, I'd say better safe than sorry.
Regarding dangerous or not climate change for Latvia? Is it just sea level rise, or there is something else we should be cautioned?
Okay, maybe just reflection, maybe from the experience of the last years. I think that for Latvia it's quite a big challenge actually, because we can see that in the past years this water amount is becoming more and more heavier, and actually our infrastructure, roads and other the drainage systems actually are not ready for this. And so I think if we will not think about how to solve this, how to adapt to these changes in water amounts, then it could be economical heavy problem for us.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I understand the scope of this. Today's seminar is more or less climate change, but you can look on not only from scientific perspective, but you can look from human perspective. And I think the challenge for Latvia with regard to climate change or adaptation or even saving energy comes extremely just from the east. Get rid of the fossil fuel and create your economy which is not fossil fuel based. It's also a geopolitical issue, it's a security issue, and that would be good for climate as well. But just to make the things more complicated, whenever you talk climate, it's probably the most popular one on the political agenda of the real environmental challenges. We still have other planetary boundaries. We have depletion of fresh water and fish resources and oceans and particles in the atmosphere and biodiversity, and so we need to juggle even many more ones, and these are also interacting parts of the whole issue about the climate change. So probably the danger is not the right way to address the issue. It's about really challenges. And the problem is that I think it is a long-term problem, and our thinking and democratical cycles are short-term. And probably structures are not ready to address just simply from the legal perspective or whatever regulation perspective. So we have to think out also some kind of mechanisms, even innovative public governance mechanisms as well. So those are challenges, those are not that much threats.
I just wanted to add one aspect, and that concerns human health. We've already heard about adaptation needs in the water sector. The summer heat waves are affecting human health also in the developed world. And if you look at larger cities, even London, Stockholm, there's evidence that high summer temperatures cause an increase in mortality. And with an aging population, this challenge is becoming larger. And this is another challenge for adaptation and a technological change, a push towards the use of air conditioning to a larger extent than before. So adaptive pressure with respect to climate change is certainly there, but we need to ask and look for sectors where we actually reach limits to adaptation and be careful of those.
Okay, thank you. And just to involve the public, I have a volunteer, Luchka. Can we have a mic for Luchka from the back? And if you have some comments and want to express your view and get involved in the conversation, just raise your hand and we will give you a mic as well, especially if you still have some concerns that you would like to clarify or
I would
challenge us.
Really interesting in that your question was what is when it comes danger to the Latvia, but we should not look very narrow, because we live in globalized world. So even if nothing happens in Latvia, there's a danger. You import food, you export whatever. So all this trade can be quite changed so if something happened in the Gulf of Mexico, for instance, the next day the price of oil goes up. So it's dangerous even if it doesn't happen here. So the concept of danger is much broader than just what's happening in the country.
Yes, thank you, Luchka, for reminding us. And it's also responsibility, concept of responsibility. We shouldn't be arrogant and think that if we are okay, then we shouldn't care about. Yes, please.
I work in an international company called Fortum, and when I was asking this question to my colleagues in Sweden, the first answer was, what about immigration? Do you think really that the climate change is not influencing immigration in Africa and developing countries? And that's really made me to think, is it so, and that it's really the true, that one of the drivers for immigration is that climate change, where people are suffering from lack of water, lack of cooling. Actually, it's too hot in that areas, and that people are coming to Europe. And we don't have today in Latvia so many maybe people crossing our border. But if we look in perspective and a little bit broader, then we have a lot of immigrants in Sweden. We have a lot of immigration coming to Germany, in Europe, and that distance is so small, and the planet is one, and the square meters or square kilometers are the same, as it's not becoming larger, but population is becoming a lot larger, and that's a challenge we will face.
Thank you very much. Other comments from the floor, maybe, to get involved in the conversation? Yeah, of course. This is free world.
Probably the most known international military conflict right now is in Syria all the time, for a long time. But much less people know that for years there is droughts, there is no things to harvest, And that's another that's part of the tension between the tribes and different religious groups. And there is a whole concept of the climate refugees. And military conflict not necessarily is the origin at the very heart of the conflicts. So you would have, it's not only based on droughts, you would have on extreme weather events, on whatever, tsunamis or landslides or just anything. But it is difficult to adapt to those things. You can't change. Like Vichka said, you can't build a wall and fix your climate problem in the one specific spot. So to say, it's not spot-specific climate problems. They are all exported. So to say, we all share those problems, and that's again to stress that the human nature is. Probably we like stable conditions, and that's one big challenge, that we will have changing conditions both for individuals and businesses and governments in future. So we will have to figure out this more flexibility, which is by nature we like to be lazy and do the same thing as we have been doing for generations, and our adaptation is very slow.
Okay, thanks. Any other comments maybe from yours? Yes.
To add to this, to these last two interventions, which were, I think, emphasizing the global connectivity of the problem very nicely. There will be places, and the small islands have been a prominent example to start with. Now, if we think of heat waves, there are places on the planet where humans cannot be outdoors during the outdoor temperatures if high temperatures combined with high humidity. So there will be areas which are no longer suitable as human habitat. And humans have colonized the whole planet during more or less 8,000 years of climate stability. We have had tremendous population growth, and there will be increasingly places where people can no longer live, and these people need to go somewhere. And if we let climate change go unabated, then we will generate a huge migration pressure. And this migration, as these colleagues have said, is ending up often in Europe.
Yes, and I think definitely people in Latvia would be worried about migration, for sure. So we have comment from the back, and afterwards I will ask final comments from your side, and then we will proceed with the next part of the discussion. So, yes?
I have one additional question, and this is, I suppose that everyone agrees that there is a lot of scientific evidence that climate change is happening. Nevertheless, there are some countries, and there is one very big country, which is the United States of America. And how do you think, if they are not in the boat, is it possible to solve the problem?
Okay, who is ready to pick up? Yes?
This is a question that is asked increasingly, and certainly it's not a black and white situation. We all know about the federal government of the United States, but we also know that the United States consists of 50 states that have their own policies. Large cities have their own policies. Currently, the government of New York is suing the federal government because of inaction in the context of climate change. Certainly all the countries, the states along the West Coast are unified in their view of climate change and ocean acidification and other challenges that are happening along their coasts. So I think we should not give up hope that this country will stay in the boat, and that what we are currently seeing is a transient phenomenon.
Okay, thank you. And then my final question to everybody of you, just to wrap up the conversation. It is very obvious that we now have to act without any delay, and the sooner the better, and the more the better. But then it's still a question of convincing those which are decision makers to act. And here, I guess, the argumentation lies within the science and within the facts regarding the face of climate change and what it is. So I would like to ask you or ask for a suggestion. What would you say to the government or to the household in order to make it act and mitigate climate change and adapt? What would be the message, either for the government or for the household? Because I believe those two are quite significant players, and we cannot really act unless both of them start moving. So what would be the message? So who would like to start?
I can have a little bit, probably, sorry for that longer answer, but household, of course, is an important part, but it has only freedom of action limits set up by the community. If you do something good, but your community is not providing, for instance, public transportation, you lack means to make those choices towards better climate-friendly activity. The same is with regards to the community. Community has only limits certain if the governmental policies and frameworks are set in place. So it's both bottom-up and top-down approaches. And governments actually, thank you for your job, but your job is mainly because somewhere in Europe people are thinking about the climate more than our own government is thinking. So that's how it is. And so the effort, everyone, depending, are you a businessman or a political leader or individual or committed person, everyone has his own point of entrance to doing this. But there is no one single, to my understanding, no one single pill. And just to finish it off, regarding the migration, it's not only people are migrating now, it's plants and animals and diseases, everyone is migrating now. And as a trivia fact, not everyone in the room knows that in Latvia, for instance, jackal now is legally in a hunting register, shakals. Yeah, of course he's a migrant, you know.
It's a hard question, but I think looking at the situation in Latvia, that maybe government is not the right solution because no one likes what government is saying and what is asking to do. But I think we should more think about ourselves, habitats at our homes, and maybe this household level would be the first one. And I liked Mrs. Luchkas, she said about this energy saving, which is the first step actually, and I think for Latvia it's perfect where we can start to start think about where we can save the energy at any type of our daily activities, cars, house, lighting and other things. So I think for me this household level is more reachable and more, maybe this reaction could be more effective than maybe these different government decisions and etc. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. There is one important result of the last assessment report by Working Group 3 that I would like to emphasize here, that the cost of taking action, the cost of transformation is below 1%, much below 1% of the gross national product, or whatever you want to call as a number. So despite our own felt uncertainty about how the future might look like with this transition, it doesn't cost the world to save the planet. I mean, that is a key. That is a key message, and clearly there are economic opportunities that are already exploited. We've mentioned the example of the renewable energy by solar and wind that could be much expanded in its exploitation, and there will be other new items. I think it needs the inertia. There is currently inertia in the system, which comes from the short-term election cycles in those countries that are dominating the economic world, the short-term perspective, and the uncertainty about how the future will look like in a world where we undergo this transformation, whether we will lose jobs, like short-term job security is very important. But I think if we consider the long-term perspectives with respect to the impacts of climate change and that we have choices to make, and the choices have to be made nowadays, today essentially. In 2020, countries have made the decision to implement the Paris Agreement. They are currently struggling to get their act together and to write up what in detail each country needs to be doing. So we are on our way, and everybody needs to take this on board, and at all levels of society.
Thank you.
Yeah, maybe I'm a bit a pessimist, but I believe the only language or the way how we can talk maybe with the government that I could understand is through the potential damage costs, and not even like a potential gains what we could get from effective adaptation, but simply what we will lose if we will not adapt. Because I think there is a long way to rise this level of awareness even at the governmental level. So that could be problematic, and I believe in the longer period, one of the solutions could be education, system of education, because as far as I know, still in the schools and high schools, this level of awareness is not at sufficient level, I would like to say, because I believe, okay, we can change this generation, but there is a potential what we can do already today to give some kind of education to the younger generation, and they will be someday like in this hall, and we'll discuss, and maybe some of them will be at the parliament. So that's the way how we could deal, I believe.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for being honest. It's not a simple problem, otherwise we would have solved it already a long time ago. So thank you very much. Let's give a big round of applause to the panel. And before they leave, I wanted to present them small gifts. These are pens. No, well, the old-fashioned memory stick. Yes, pens from a wood. And if you have any good thoughts, just write them down now in a colorful and friendly manner. So thank you very much.